Oh, how I love it when this time rolls around. Am I talking about my birthday? Nope, that was a few months ago. Am I talking about fall? No, because it's not quite here yet. I'm talking about the time when I get to do a low effort Star Trek video. That's right, my friends. It's another not actually Trek, actually comment response video where you have already done most of the work for me, and all I have to do is read some of the comments that you have left on my recent Star Trek related videos and then shoot my mouth off about it. Let's get started. These first several comments are from my most recent Trek Actually video about the series finale of Enterprise and whether or not it actually happened within the fictional world of Star Trek. And this first comment is from Get No Happy, who says, when someone writes a love letter to fans that is so crushingly bad and poorly received that some fans think it was actually an intentional fuck you to the fans, I profoundly want to know what they were thinking. Like, walk me through every decision that was made. I hear ya. But really, if you ask me, the number one mistake that they made, the first misstep, was in even trying to write a love letter to fans in the first place. I know it sounds like a nice idea, and of course, when they do a good job at something like this, some people, like other people, critics or fans, will say, oh, that was wonderful. It was a nice love letter to the fans. It's okay if it kind of works out that way, but I don't think the writers or the creators of a show, any show, or any, comic book issue or movie or whatever, you should never sit down with the intention, okay, everybody, let's write a love letter to the fans. That's not your job. You shouldn't even be thinking about that. If you want to write a love letter to the fans, if you want to serve the fans and make them happy, make the best episode you can make. Don't worry about pandering to them. It's like, oh, let's make the people happy. Let's let them know that we appreciate them. Let's really give them a love letter. No, the love letter is you make a good show. That's the love letter. Here's one from Beard78748. Steve forgot to talk about the third thing wrong with the episode. Travis is still an ensign. What did he do to the captain? Did he kill his dog? Did he murder the enlisted crew? I think we're overlooking the most obvious explanation for why Captain Archer never promoted Travis. He just forgot the guy was there. And if that is indeed the case, at least Captain Archer is in good company, because the same thing happened to the writers of the show for most of it. This comment is from MH6470. Whoever came up with the idea that Trip faked his death to become a spy has never really watched the show, or simply and desperately wanted him to survive. Trip's entire personality is not suitable for being a spy. He is basically the polar opposite of Malcolm, who legitimately is a spy. There are actually ways of having Trip be alive after the Enterprise finale that would not require turning him into a spy who faked his death, like to fool his friends. But you could also have everything that happens to the Enterprise crew in that series finale still happen. You could do, it's Star Trek. You could do anything. You could have Trip be beamed away at the moment of his death by some aliens, and they replace his body with like a duplicate, so his friends and family think he's dead and they bury what they think is his body, but actually the real Trip is somewhere else being subjected to an experiment or something. Like, it's Star Trek. Something, he could have been abducted or taken away somehow in a way that the other characters didn't know about, but that wouldn't have required you to have Trip lie to his friends and have to completely leave his old life behind forever and take on a new life that, as you point out in your comment, MH, doesn't really seem like the sort of thing Trip would do. Like, it's such an excessive, needlessly complicated workaround when the end goal is just, well, they killed off Trip in the Enterprise finale, and I don't like that. I want Trip to still be alive after that. There's so many other ways to do that. And making him a spy seems like not just contrary to his established character, but way, way, way more complicated than it needs to be. This next comment is from Gordon McDowell8117. I have zero problems with this kind of episode as a diversion, unless it's the series finale. The worst moment of this episode for me was having Archer just about to make his speech that would lead to the creation of the Federation, but the simulation stopping short of him giving the actual speech. For a show designed to inspire hope about the future, giving moving speeches and sell merch, this is unforgivable. I've seen a lot of people say this over the years, and I completely disagree with this. I have no desire to see Captain Archer give his speech. And I'll tell you why. A lot of people make this argument that you're kind of making here, which is, why wouldn't we see Captain Archer's speech? It's a Star Trek show. Star Trek characters are always giving big speeches, right? Captain Kirk has some big inspiring speeches during Star Trek. Captain Picard is known for giving big, inspiring speeches. It's practically a character trait of Captain Picard to do that. Even Sisko has some, rousing, inspiring, or at least very memorable speeches during his Deep Space Nine run. Like giving the big speech is a Star Trek hero kind of thing. Except whenever Captain Picard gives a speech, or Captain Kirk gives a speech, they're giving a speech in the context of a dramatic scene that is happening in the moment, and they're talking to the other people in the room with them. They're not up on stage, standing behind a lectern, giving a pre-written speech at an event. It's not like a commencement address, it's not a State of the Union speech. They're not giving a speech in the reality of the scene. That's a completely different vibe. And to me, it's just not dramatically interesting at all. If a character is feeling impassioned and they're just called in the moment to give a big dramatic theatrical speech, it's drama, it's theater, it's TV, it's film, right? We can do that. They can get away with that if it's good enough. Yeah, people in real life don't tend to speechify like that, but in a theatrical, in a dramatic context, yeah, absolutely. But it's in the context of a scene. They're talking to other people. They're trying to make a case or convince people of something, like in that moment. They're not giving a pre-arranged, pre-prepared speech. And that's what Archer would have been doing in that scene. And I'm sorry, I can't think of anything more boring. These next several comments are from my video looking at the subject of whether or not the Cardassians are Star Trek's space Nazis. This one is from Mixup9003. The Nazis were definitely colonial. They used the exact same playbook, but instead of going to another continent to invade and pillage, they went into Western nations and Russia, where they basically did the exact same thing other colonial powers had previously done, but on occasion population instead. I'm not quite sure what you were trying to say there. Occasion is a typo, but I think we get the general idea. Anyway, nice video. You always make great analogies. Keep it up. Thank you very much for the kind words there. This was by far the most common subject for comments on this video. So like at least half the comments on this video were people like just racing to the front saying, Steve, you're wrong. The Nazis were colonialist. And the thing they cite is the German policy, which later became a Nazi policy. It was a policy of German governments previous to the Nazis, but the Nazis definitely adopted it and made it very much their own thing. And it was the Lebensraum policy. I think I'm pronouncing that right, Lebensraum. And it means living space. And there's Hitler would talk about how, the German people need living space. They need breathing room, right? And of course, I'm aware of that. And I certainly did not mean to imply in my video by any stretch of the imagination that the Nazi government was anything other than aggressively expansionist. And, they were definitely invaders and occupiers of other people's countries, Poland, France, Greece, the list goes on and on and on, right? So that was not my intention at all to imply that the Nazis were not doing those things and that they did not have plans to do much, much more of that on a far larger scale. The Nazi regime was certainly expansionist and intended to be expansionist. And I think that's what the Lebensraum policy was. When I say colonialist, and this, I think the reason why the misunderstanding is, and I'm sure it's my fault, it's just my own, the way I sort of define these words in my head, and maybe I should have made more of an effort to clarify this in the video. When I think of the word colonial, when I think of colonialism, I do mean going to a far off place, right? Like an overseas colony, a colony on another continent, a colony like what Germany did to a certain extent decades before the Nazis ever came to power. There were German colonies in Africa, I believe, during like the imperial German period. And I think those colonies were no longer in German possession by the time the Nazis came to power. But that's the kind of thing I think of when I think of colonialism, a central power exerting control over places that are far from that power, right? Like the American colonies used to be for the British Empire, you know, or the French colonies in Southeast Asia, that kind of thing. It doesn't mean that what the Nazis did to their neighbors and to the surrounding countries in Europe is not absolutely unacceptable and deplorable, and doesn't have a lot of things in common with how what I call colonialism was done. I mean, there's, it's exploitation, it's invasion, it's imposing authority on people who didn't ask for it and don't want it. And I mean, it's all of the things that are wrong about colonialism were also wrong about what the Nazis did to Poland and France and et cetera, et cetera. But in my mind, I don't consider that to be colonialist. And maybe I'm splitting hairs with that. And I'm also not saying that if the Nazis had not remained in power longer, that they wouldn't have been colonialists, that they wouldn't have, conquered overseas people. Like there's nothing about their character that leads me to believe they would be above that sort of thing. So that's my point. I wasn't trying to say that the Nazis weren't what is being described in this comment and in a lot of other comments. It just, to me, in my head, when I think of how the Nazis expanded to invade neighboring countries in Europe, I don't think of that specifically as colonialist. I think of that as expansionist. And to me, obviously they're similar things and they're both very bad things. But in my head, when I was writing that script and when I was doing that video, when I think of colonialism, I think of overseas colonialism. And I don't think the Nazis did that, which is not to let the Nazis off the hook for any fucking thing they did. Because hopefully you can tell, I kind of think they were the worst. Here's one from Opinions No One Cares About. In the Cardassian criminal justice system, there isn't any. Chung chung. That's good. That's good work there. Makes me wish that they had shelled out to cast Sam Waterston as the Cardassian DA. Here's one from Ghost Porcupine regarding the characters being way more charismatic than the real-life analogs. I had the same feeling about Dedra and Cyril in Andor. Such compelling little weirdos, and then the people like that in real life are boring as fuck, motivated solely by power, control, and fragile ego. It does make me wonder if we should be making the characters way less interesting, but then would anyone watch? I'll tell you something else, specifically about Andor. And I saw this happen like on social media. There were people who were watching Andor when season 2 was coming out, who were much bigger fans of it than I was. Like I've said before, like I admire a lot of things about Andor, but I do not find it a very good show overall. I did not enjoy watching a lot of it because it's just so fucking dull and uneventful. But when it did get good, it got really good. And there's a lot about it, in terms of the story it's trying to tell and the message of it, the unapologetic anti-fascist element of it that I really admire, and I'm glad that it exists. But there were people who were like way more into it in terms of drama and as a show than I was. And because some of the Imperial characters were so well drawn and were so interesting. Like, I can't remember his name, but the old guy, right? The old man who was like Dedra's boss. Yeah, I'm sure you all are yelling the name at the screen right now. I can't remember because I didn't give a fuck about that character like most of the characters. But that guy, right? There was someone I follow on like Blue Sky maybe who posted about an episode where, the old guy had some kind of a big role or had a big scene with Dedra maybe. And they said, yeah, he reminds me of like one of my old teachers who I really loved. And they had concocted in their head this idea that by the end of the series, it was going to be revealed that actually he was secretly on the rebellion side. he was secretly a good guy. He couldn't actually be really working for the Empire because he was too likable and too wise, and too fatherly. And I bet it's going to turn out that he's really a good guy and not a bad guy. And I thought, man, what a dangerous mindset that is. And it's not necessarily the fault of the show. It's the fault of the person watching, that they have allowed themselves to be taken in by what they perceive as the charming fascist. Oh, he's so charming and likable and wise. And, this reminds me of like my old teacher in college, my old professor. And I just love that guy. And he's not going to turn out to be a bad guy. Wow. Wow. No. Now, these next several comments are from my video about how Star Trek actually gets racism wrong. This first one is from Jareth0205, who says, to be fair to Styles, the Romulan commander does also look exactly like Spock's father. Styles, of course, being the Enterprise crew member from the classic episode Balance of Terror, who sees Romulans on the view screen for the first time, notices that they look exactly like Vulcans, and immediately becomes super racist and suspicious of Spock. It's a fair point, I suppose, that the Romulan commander does look exactly like Spock's dad. But here's my question. How the hell does Styles know what Spock's father looks like? Yeah, he's an ambassador, he's famous, but come on, do you know what all the ambassadors from your country look like? Would you be able to spot them on sight? I don't think so. Stalker much? Styles? This comment is from Kanuovea. Point of order, evolution does not go from low to high levels of evolution. So even when Star Trek gets it close to right, they're still wrong about evolution. That's true, but when Spock says that, he is more right than Star Trek usually is when a character is asked to describe how evolution works. And I am somewhat sympathetic to Spock making that particular mistake, because I made the exact same mistake when I was asked to describe evolution in one of my college biology courses. It wound up being maybe my favorite biology course I ever had to take. One of my favorite college courses ever. It was a great sort of entry-level 101 level biology class that I took my first year of college, and it was called the Unity and Diversity of Living Things. And it was all about evolution. That was the main subject of the entire course. And it was fascinating. And I already knew a lot about sort of the basics of evolution just from my own personal interest in some reading I had done, but I had never actually taken a class and been taught, evolution. So I had that sort of general assumption going in that it's from the lower orders to the higher orders, that it's from less sophisticated to more sophisticated. And even though that is in practice what often happens, that's not by definition what evolution is. It's not from less sophisticated to more sophisticated. It's change over time and adaptation to the environment. And that can mean acquiring greater complexity across generations, or it can sometimes mean acquiring less complexity if that is better suited to survival in a given environment. So yes, you are correct. Spock is technically wrong. I was technically wrong at first before I took the class when I said that. But it's still closer to the right answer than Star Trek ever got before, or I think has even gotten since. So climb off of Spock's ass, would you? This one is from Fusion1. The point is made that McCoy is racist due to things like green-blooded, etc., but there is no mention of Spock's constant demeaning of humans, complaining that they are illogical all the time. That's true, but it's a little bit like a black person talking shit about white people in the United States, isn't it? Spock was the only Vulcan, really in classic Star Trek, Spock is the only non-human on the entire ship. He's surrounded by humans, and he's the only Vulcan there, ever. Unless you want to jump ahead to the animated series, and then Eric's and the cat lady are there. There are a few non-humans on the crew by the time we get to the animated series. But in classic Star Trek, Spock is the only non-human there. And he's surrounded by these humans. And one of the humans that he has to work with all the time, Dr. McCoy, is constantly giving him shit about being a Vulcan. And every once in a while, he gives it back by saying, by sort of giving some side eye to humans, or saying something smart ass to humans, or something cutting about human nature and like that sort of thing. I think I'm going to give Spock a pass on that. Like, yeah, okay, it's not cool. It's judging it's judging people based on their race, based on their species, and that's wrong, and we shouldn't do that. But if you're the only representative of your people in a group surrounded by other people who are constantly like making fun of you and talking shit about you because of the group you're in, I'm not going to be so mad at you. I might be like, okay, technically he's wrong to do that, but like, I kind of get it. I'm not going to, he's not going to hear about it from me. I'll put it that way. Here's one from Black Romulan. Star Trek is not perfect when it comes to race, but it tries. I wouldn't be a Black Romulan if it didn't try. This is a very good point. Star Trek is not perfect when it comes to race, but it tries. It's not perfect when it comes to any of its political or social commentary, because it is the product of imperfect human storytellers with their own limited perspectives and their own biases and their own areas of ignorance. It's never going to be perfect, but a good faith effort is made. Hopefully, mistakes are acknowledged and learned from. Hopefully, that's not always the case. And, we see even in the current production era of Star Trek, in our supposedly more enlightened, modern age, at least for some of us, there are mistakes made. There are oversights. There are things that they get wrong when they try to tell these kinds of stories in Star Trek. That's fine. The most important thing is that you are open-minded, you are making an effort, and you are willing to learn and to try and do better in the future. That's the most important thing. And that's the lesson we should all take from Star Trek. You don't have to be perfect. You can fuck up. You can make a mistake. You can misspeak. You can show yourself to be ignorant. You can say something that you shouldn't say based on your limited perspective or your innate biases or whatever. Like that in and of itself is not an unforgivable sin. The unforgivable sin is when you plant your feet and ball up your fists and hold your breath and you refuse to learn. That's what people will blame you for. These next few comments are from my video looking at the Star Trek Green Lantern comics crossover. This first one is from Michael Hanneline, who says, watch a YouTube video where an attractive, intelligent, charismatic, and modest guy provides an extremely abbreviated but compelling and hilarious summary. Man, that sounds really good. It's a shame there's nothing like that on YouTube. Someone should get on that. Well, I would just caution that someone from personal experience that if they do get on it, they should be prepared to not be nearly as popular as they deserve to be. This one is from Will M. Frank. Red lantern rings are powered by rage, not unlike certain other red wearable accessories. God damn, there's another one. Yeah, great observation. I wish I had made it in my video. Like, y'all are really showing me up this time. And I have to ask, what did I ever do to you to deserve this? Besides give you years and years of entertaining videos, often about Star Trek, which is something I sense we have a mutual interest in, filled with admittedly subpar jokes, but even so, here's one from Blue Beetle 1939. All my Kyle Rayner books wind up in the fridge for some reason. Motherfucker! It's good. It's a good joke. It's a good joke. It's a good joke. I wish I had thought of it. Here's one from Gamma Ray Burst, an extremely dead skeleton. Those are the kind I prefer. I find the partially dead ones so troublesome. Me too, man, because like, how do you half kill a skeleton? You know what I'm saying? If it's a dead skeleton, it's a dead skeleton. You don't have to worry about it. If it's a half-dead skeleton, then how do you kill a skeleton exactly halfway? Because if you kill it any more than halfway, it's going to just go right back around and be partially alive again. It's a pain in the ass. Here's one from Charles Johnson. Trelane and Mr. Mixiez Pitlick have a conversation about who's better, Kirk or Superman, and it's everyone's problem. This is a really good pitch for a Star Trek Superman crossover. I like this a lot. And then at the end of it, you could do the tease for a sequel. Whether they actually do a sequel or not is irrelevant, but you do a little tease for a sequel where, like, sitting at the next booth over in the diner or the restaurant or wherever, where Trelane and Mixie are having their argument that we've seen for the entire crossover, you sort of do the camera pan, or the comic book equivalent of the camera pan, over to the next booth, and it's Q and Batmite. And, obviously they would be arguing over, who is better, Captain Picard or Batman. And they can be kind of looking with annoyance in Trelane and Mixie's direction and be like, oh, listen to those two, what a dumb argument, like, to set up the next one, which will be Q and Batmite arguing over. You get it. That's it. That's what I got. Aaron Redding, Green Lanterns have a cool power set because their power is creative instead of destructive. The lore is a bit hard to get past because it has changed a few times, and it's the most obtuse of all the main DC titles. That is a writer's problem, and it is only a writer's problem if the writer allows it to be a problem. Complicated lore does not need to matter any more than you as the writer allow it to matter. I remember one of the justifications when they did a 0 Hour in DC Comics in the 90s, which was kind of a revision of the Crisis on Infinite Earths reset. Like, it wasn't a complete hard reboot of the entire line of the entire universe, but it was kind of just a little to sort of smooth things out, right? And one of the examples that they cited, that the editors of DC Comics cited for wanting to do a 0 Hour thing to kind of rejigger the continuity a little bit more, was, well, we have characters like Hawkman who have such a complicated backstory and it confuses the fans. And I, even at the time when I was a teenager and I was a little bit more susceptible to these kinds of nerdy concerns, I thought, yeah, but if the writer of the Hawkman book just makes it clear which Hawkman this is and what his backstory is like, why does it matter? It only matters if the writer makes it matter. If you tell a good story, and through the telling of your story, you make it clear who everyone is and what we need to know about their pasts, anything beyond that is, if there are still readers, if you do your job as a writer and there are still readers who are like, but what about this? What about that? Does he still remember what happened in issue 12, 15 years ago? Like, that's that guy's problem. That's that fucking pedantic nerd's problem. Fuck that nerd. You tell your story as best as you can. And if there is a really complicated, confusing lore that's been built up over the decades, which there probably is if it's a comic book character, you just make it clear to your readers which parts of it they need to worry about by reminding them of it in your story. And then everything else, just forget about it. And if we trained comic book readers and audience members in general to approach stories like that, we wouldn't have needed, or DC Comics editors wouldn't have felt like they needed, to do fucking 5 or 6 reboots of the universe that they have. Because it wouldn't matter. Because it shouldn't matter any more than a particular storyteller needs it to matter for the story they're telling. And one more from the Star Trek Green Lantern video. This is from Multimac D. So they basically turned Spock into the DC equivalent of Captain Planet to defeat Necron. Got it. Hey, there's an idea for a crossover. Star Trek Captain Planet? That would be amazing. They find, like, the Captain Planet rings after hundreds of years, and various Star Trek characters put them on, and then their powers combine, and they summon Captain Planet, and then Captain Planet ruins everybody's day by flying around and pointing out all of the shitty things that are still problems on Earth that everybody ignores or thought that they fixed. Like, he has, he sort of troubleshoots all the environmental issues that still exist on 23rd century Earth, and then people don't like him because he's kind of pissing on their parade, and everybody likes to think that Earth is perfect now. And Captain Planet's like, well, but you still have this and this and this, and this could use some work. And eventually they just take off the rings and bury them and forget that Captain Planet is there. Because when you get right down to it, even in the 23rd century, humans still suck. I don't know. People might not want to read that, but that's why they should have to read it. This next group of comments are from my video about times where Starfleet has abandoned its ideals. This first one is from Pyro Nuke 4768. At this point, the Prime Directive has shifted from don't interfere to don't get caught interfering. Well, yeah, but isn't that every rule? As the great philosopher Jesse the Body Ventura once said, it's only cheating if you get caught. Which can be applied to so many different areas of life. Paul Scott 1792 says, I think the difference between the two relocations kind of is that the first group were Federation citizens. They are part of the society and expected to follow the laws, etc., while in insurrection, it's being done to an independent culture who the Federation has no legal right to move. It's not morally satisfying, but it's legally consistent and probably an appealing distinction to Picard. There are other differences as well. If you really want to drill down and compare the proposed forced relocation in the TNG episode Journey's End and the proposed forced relocation of the Baku in the movie Insurrection, like there are differences between them. The proposed forced relocation of the Native American descendants in the Journey's End episode, as bad as it is, and as indefensible as it is, and as much as that episode, I think, wants us to want that to not happen, at least that's being done above board, right? Like, even though they don't really have a say in it, like they're still being forced to move, at least the people of that colony are being told up front, hey, we know this sucks. We know you're not going to be happy about this, but if you don't agree to move, we're going to have to move you. It's going to happen by this date. Like, this is the cutoff. These are the resources we're making available to you in the aftermath. Like, it's being done like out front to everybody's face. Whereas in Insurrection, they're going to kidnap people in the night and beam them into a holodeck and make them think they're still on their planet, and then secretly move them to another planet, apparently without telling them any of this at any point during this process. And then once they're transplanted on a new planet, they're just going to naturally begin to age and die, which they wouldn't have done because their old planet was the Fountain of Youth planet. So, like, it takes something that is already bad and makes it even worse by adding in these other elements of secrecy and deception to it. So I think you can make the case that what they want to do in Insurrection, like specifically, is worse than what they want to do to those people in the Journey's End episode. But how much weight you give those differences, I suppose, is up to you. But maybe that's also something that weighed on Picard's mind and caused him to have a much stronger negative reaction to what was happening in Insurrection than what was happening in Journey's End. This comment is from Kevin Moore Toons. The treatment of Data, denying his personhood despite his years of service to Starfleet and the Federation, reminds me very much of the immigrants who have served honorably in the U.S. Armed Forces only to be arrested by ICE and deported, stripped of their due process rights, and treated like garbage by the very country they risked their lives for. And not only what you just said, the immigrants who served in the armed forces and now are being mistreated. Another example, and we can also look to the American Armed Forces for this one as well, trans people who have served their country honorably for years, who have put their lives on the line for this country, who have done everything that people are told they're supposed to do. But simply because they're transgender and the people currently in charge of the government are transphobic bigots, and that is the only reason why this is happening, because Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth and all of the people in charge at the moment are transphobic bigots. Trans people in the military have been, as you said about immigrants, they've been treated like garbage. They've been thrown out of the military without even so much as a thank you. They've been just shoveled out the door, like their service and their lives meant nothing. And it's disgusting, and it's indefensible. And yet, it has happened. So yeah, when you see Starfleet mistreat Data in The Measure of a Man, and if not for Picard and Data challenging it and taking it to a legal proceeding, presumably Starfleet Command would have just allowed Bruce Maddox to take Data apart and possibly kill him for a research project. And you think, oh, they would never do that. Oh, really? Here's a comment from Craftsman of Awesomeness. The Federation is not a nation state. It does not represent a single nation, like definitionally based on what it is. Interesting. I have a two-part response to this comment. The first part is to say that technically you are correct. I suppose rather than calling it a nation state, it would have been more appropriate of me to describe it as a supranational union, an interstellar equivalent of the European Union, for example. And then the second part is, shut your face, nerd! This comment is from Rick Conway 8719. The synth ban is the most non-Star Trek thing I've ever seen in Star Trek. One of the many reasons I don't particularly like Picard Season 1. The synth ban is contrary to the values stated by Starfleet. That's absolutely true. But part of the point of that story, as badly told and all over the place and unfocused and imperfect as season 1 of Picard is, although, I mean, compared to season 2, Jesus, it's practically a masterpiece. But like, part of the point of that is, yes, the synth ban is bad, and Starfleet should not have done it. So we should be glad at the end of the season when that situation is corrected. Just like, yes, it's wrong that they were going to force Data to submit himself to an experiment that could have killed him just because he was an android in Measure of a Man. Yes, that's bad. That's wrong. Starfleet should not do that. That's the point. That's the point of the story. The ban on genetically engineered people. Actually, how is Starfleet banning genetically engineered people any different morally or philosophically than banning synth people? I mean, it's basically the same thing. You're barring an entire category of people based on isolated incidents that it would be unfair to hold everybody else in that group guilty for. Do you consider the ban on genetically engineered people to be also in a tie with the synth ban, the most non-Star Trek thing you've ever seen? And does that make you not want to watch TNG or not want to watch Deep Space Nine or Strange New Worlds or other shows where that has come up as a plot point? Like, honestly, I don't really get this at it. Who gives a fuck about what is or isn't a non-Star Trek thing in terms of like plot stuff? A non-Star Trek thing would be to do an episode that says, actually, war is good, or actually, the Nazis were right, or actually, yeah, you know what, sometimes progressive social movements go too far. Some people, it's possible for some people to have too many rights. You know, sometimes minority groups need to just relax and be patient. Like, if Star Trek were making episodes with those kinds of political messaging, then I would say that's non-Star Trek, because that's completely contrary to what Star Trek has always been. But to have like fictional institutions within the fiction of Star Trek behaving in ways that are contrary to their stated values as part of a story that is ultimately meant to reinforce and celebrate those values and remind us of the importance of staying true to them, how is that not the most Star Trek thing? And this final group of comments are from my recent video about the existential horror of Thomas Riker. This first one is from Robert Jazzo, who says, I like to think Will Riker briefly contemplated the existential horror of the situation, decided to give Thomas their trombone, and considered the matter closed. That thought fills me with delight because I too like to think of Will Riker, and I think maybe this is one of the reasons why that character appeals to me so much. He seems like just the least neurotic guy you could ever meet. You know, if you watch all the episodes and the movies, if you follow the character through all of the adventures of his that we see, like he has just like most Star Trek characters, he has every reason in the world to be the most traumatized, anxious, fucked up guy. But he seems like exactly the opposite. He's chill, he's laid back, he's cool. He doesn't seem like he doesn't seem brooding or preoccupied. He's just a good hang. You know, after everything he's been through, after all the tortures, after all the close brushes with death, after all of the times where the fundamental nature of his own reality was questioned. Like, he's just kind of cool. He just rolls with it. And I love that. I love thinking of Riker as just the least neurotic, most level-headed guy that you could ever want to meet. And he is that and will always be that, despite living a life that to anybody else, to any of us here in the real world, would be a fucking waking nightmare. Still on the subject of the transporters, here's one from Mr. The White 2620. This episode is part of what made me realize that transporters don't teleport people from one place to another. They're murder clone machines. Everyone who steps in a transporter dies, ceases to exist, and what comes out the other end is an identical clone, not the original person. This is a perfectly reasonable interpretation of how the transporter works in Star Trek. And there are episodes, including Second Chances, the episode that I talk about in this video, the Thomas Riker episode, that give you evidence of this, that this is in fact how the transporters work. It's a terrific argument, except for the fact that the show itself explicitly says that's not how they work. In multiple occasions, they make it clear that actually it is a teleporter, and actually it's not making a copy of you and killing the original and just recreating an identical version of you on the other end, that it is literally you, your molecules, your cells, your atoms, whatever, that are being physically moved from one place to another. You as a body are being deconstructed, and your original parts are being moved to another location and then reassembled. That is how the transporter works. Now, does that make any sense in the context of what happens to Will Riker and Thomas Riker? No, it does not. That makes no sense at all, because if the transporter actually worked the way I just described, where you're just taken apart and put back together at a different location, then what happens to Will and Thomas could not possibly happen. Because if you were split in half, you wouldn't have two whole complete people in two locations. You'd have two dead people who were half of themselves on each location. In this episode, it can't possibly work that way. Except throughout the rest of Star Trek, I feel like they have repeatedly said, when it has come up, when people have asked, or, when there's been, like, when a character like Barclay has expressed anxiety about the transporter, they've said, this is how it works. It doesn't kill you. You are still literally the same person on the other end. So, great argument. And I think, if you limit your context just to this episode, yeah, I think that's perfectly valid. That's perfectly valid. But if you're applying it to the entire franchise and to how transporters work throughout, like, all of Star Trek, it is not a good argument, simply because the show itself, despite all evidence to the contrary, the show itself has told you repeatedly, that's not how it works. This is how it works. And it's actually not a murder machine. I think my second ever Trek Actually video was about this. And it's basically, that's my conclusion, that yes, there's lots of evidence that it is a murder machine, except for the fact that the show tells you it's not. And it's a work of fiction, so that's what it is. And these contradictions and these incongruities that can't be resolved would not be able to coexist in reality, but in fiction they can. And that's what Star Trek is. Here's one from Tiny Gamer Alex. So much of Thomas Riker's arc is deeply relatable to us trans people who don't realize our transness until later in life. Having to admit that we're not the people we thought we were, to find new names and new selves. Yeah, I would have loved to see more Tom Riker and some deeper explorations of his trauma and loss. I feel for the dude. Yeah, and being a cis person myself, that's not something that jumped out at me right away about the character. In fact, it's not something that I even really consciously realized until I was writing this video. And it kind of hit me that what the words that I put into the Riker portrait's mouth about, sort of describing how Thomas feels. And actually, I kind of say something similar. I touch on it for myself in the video as well, not just as the Riker portrait, about how contingent our identities are, and how, Thomas felt like he had to be the one to change his name, because even though he was just as much the real Riker as Will was, everybody else saw Will as the real Riker. And even though it might not be fair, Thomas was the one who had to change, because the perception of everybody else in the world was that he was the new one, even though he wasn't really. And so he had to change. And it speaks to how much of our identity, how much of our sense of self is defined not only by how other people think of us, but also by how we react to that. So there's part of it that we can control, and there's part of it that we can't control. And I definitely understand now how that could be relatable to a trans person, how that could be analogous to a transition experience and someone who wants to change the way they are seen, someone who feels that the way other people see them is not their authentic self. You're not seeing me as the person I really am. And I need to change that. I need to transition. I need to come out as who I truly am, and then be accepted or not accepted as the person that I know I really am. And that's that, and the anxieties surrounding that and the uncertainties surrounding that. Like, yeah, a lot of that is there in Thomas's story. And again, as a cis person, I didn't catch that right away, and I didn't catch it for many, many, many years. But as I was writing this video, it did kind of dawn on me. And that's one of the reasons why the Riker portrait has that line, about saying protect the dolls. Like, it's both a joke about my Star Trek dolls on the shelf there, but of course, obviously, it's also a reference to protect the dolls, as in the call to support trans people, specifically trans women, but all trans people. So it didn't actually occur to me until I was writing the script. But I'm glad that it did. Here's one from Christopher Lanon. I'm not sure that the whole why are you and not him question makes much sense. If minds are just a thing brains do, then the Riker who got beamed to the ship is the one on the ship, and the one who didn't is that one. I don't see how it's a 50-50 chance. It was always going to be this way. I think you're overlooking the importance of the subjective experience, though. I mean, yes, minds are just a thing brains do, but once Riker was split into two Rikers, there were two brains, and therefore two minds. And the brain that wound up on the ship that got away from the planet and went on to live the rest of his life got to do that. And the brain in the version of Riker that was stranded on the planet for 8 years got to do that. And they could easily have wound up in different, like the unique individual who wound up escaping the planet could have been the one who wound up stuck on the planet, and the one who wound up stuck on the planet could have been the one who escaped. There's no way they could have controlled it. It was a completely random happenstance, and to me, I can very easily imagine myself if I were in that situation, if I was the Riker who got away. I can easily imagine it being a source of profound existential anxiety to me, imagining, what if I had been the one stuck on the planet instead? What if fate had trapped me there instead of him? And, then you get into the moral questions and philosophical questions, like why was I the one? Why was I the one to escape? And of course, there is no real answer to that other than just random chance. There is no reason why. There's no such thing as fate. That's just a construct that we came up with to try and give meaning to things. You're not the one who escaped for anything to do with you or for any reason, for any greater purpose. That's just what happened. And I think that's the truth. But for a lot of us, it feels like that's not enough. Even though we know there's really not any more other than what we bring to it ourselves, we have this yearning and this need for comfort and this need for meaning and purpose. We want there to be another reason, and maybe that doesn't appeal to you, and that's fine. But to me, like, that's one of the most interesting things about Thomas's character. And it's not really something they deal with in the episode. It's not explicitly what the story is about, but I think that is it reminds me of that fascinating philosophical question and that source of existential horror for me. What if the person trapped down there was you? What if you weren't the one who escaped? What if it was you? because it very easily could have been. This comment is from Mike Wood 8815. The real question is if the baseball is a sandwich. Given the plummeting definition of food safety and standards, the exterior could, in some places, legally be defined as a bread. And if it is a sandwich, is it a cork sandwich or a baseball sandwich? Would be a doll if it had a hat or cute scarf, maybe some clogs. Interesting. So if it's dressed as a doll, then it's a doll. You don't accept that it's a doll if it's placed in a context where it functions in the same way that dolls would. But if it is dressed as a doll, so it's the superficial appearance that allows you to define it as a doll, not the context in which it is placed. Interesting. As for whether or not the baseball is a sandwich, and if it is a sandwich, what kind of a sandwich is it? I think a lot of that will depend on what your answer is to the question of, is a burrito a sandwich? Because I think a baseball is a lot closer to a burrito than it is to a more conventional sandwich, like a meat bread sandwich. So if you consider a burrito a kind of sandwich, and some people do and some people don't, some people argue very vociferously that a burrito is not a sandwich, that not everything has to be sorted into a larger category, that a burrito is a burrito and that's what it is. It's not a sandwich and we shouldn't try to make it a sandwich. And other people will say, no, it can be a subcategory of sandwich. It can be a kind of sandwich because it has these qualities in common with a sandwich, right? It doesn't matter what side you're on, but I think which side of that you choose will influence whether or not you think a baseball can be a sandwich. Because if a burrito can be a sandwich and you can find your way to defining a baseball as a burrito, then by extension, a baseball is a sandwich. And what kind of a burrito or sandwich is it? Well, I would say yes, cork, but also twine. Let's not forget twine. So I don't think you would call it a baseball sandwich. A baseball isn't a baseball sandwich. You don't name a sandwich after the kind of sandwich it is. A hamburger sandwich, as the old people used to say, doesn't contain a hamburger. It is a hamburger. The whole thing is a hamburger, right? There's a hamburger patty, and then there's all the stuff on top of it and the bread, and the whole thing is a hamburger, right? So a baseball would not be a baseball sandwich, as in it's a baseball sandwich because it contains baseball stuff. If you wanted to say it's a kind of sandwich, then it would be a cork and twine sandwich. I think that makes perfect sense, as does everything else I just said. Here's one from Skythicon. Hold on, you said the only reason Riker comes to mind when you think of existential horror is the Thomas Riker incident? What about the amazing episode Frame of Mind? Oh, look, you're absolutely right. Frame of Mind is an amazing episode. I agree. One of my favorite TNG episodes, one of my favorite Riker episodes. However, Frame of Mind was not the episode I wanted to talk about in that video. So I hope that explains it. Here's a comment from Happy Ninja 42. The video game Soma used this very concept at the root of its theme for horror. Quite effective. The video game Soma. Interesting. So is that the video game that pro wrestlers are always playing in the locker room? And finally, from Celestial Star 6450. Steve, I would love to see you have this same conversation with Bradward Boimler of the USS Cerritos. You'd shatter his mind. Yeah, I see what you're saying, because Boimler was also the subject of a transporter duplication on lower decks. I don't know. I think I would have a great time having this conversation with Jack Quaid, the actor who plays Boimler, or, excuse me, played Boimler on lower decks, because he seems like a really cool dude and a fun guy to hang out with, and I'm sure I could talk to him for hours about nerdy Star Trek shit or anything else, and we would get along great. But I also feel like if I had to talk to Brad Boimler, the character, about this or anything else for longer than 5 minutes, forget shattering his mind. I would grab the closest heavy object and shatter his fucking skull. And I'd probably want to do the same thing with pretty much every other lower decks character, to be honest. Anyway, on that happy note that I'm sure will endear me to many of my fellow Trekkies in the audience, thank you all so much for all of your comments and questions. That was the last one. Regardless of whatever differing opinions we may have on the relative quality of various Star Trek shows, I appreciate you all so much. I love you for your attention and your support and your generosity and all of the things that you provide to me, whether that's in a monetary form or just in the form of watching and liking and sharing the videos and leaving these awesome comments. I love you guys. I could not do this without you. If you enjoy what I do here on YouTube and you want to support it in a more direct material way and enable me to continue doing this long into the future, which is where I hope to be able to do it. And you, of course, can afford a small monthly contribution. You can become a patron at patreon.com/Steve Shives. You can become a channel member by clicking the join button. You can make a one-time donation through my PayPal or my Venmo. Links to those are in the video description. Or if you can't afford to do any of that, or you just don't fucking feel like it, liking the video, sharing the video, leaving comments, whether they make it into these comment response videos or not, that all helps. I appreciate it all. I appreciate you all for being here, for watching, for enabling me to do this, for enabling me to talk about Star Trek along with all the other stuff I talk about with you, and for being interested. So that's it for this time. Have a good day. Have a good whenever it is for you. And I will see you next time. Take care of yourselves, everybody.